think there's competition
Well,
with the Patriots and
I mean,
Bruins.
you know,
There's competition with the Patriots and Bruins.
Okay, I guess we're gonna get started. I'm sorry there aren't more people here, but we don't wanna hold up everyone who is here. So, welcome, thank you for coming. I think I know most everybody, but I'm Linda King, I'm president of Bolton Local. And tonight we have with us Eric Broadbent from Harvard. I first met Eric several years ago. I was kind of involved with Harvard Local, as was he. And he has been very active in Harvard, getting Harvard to become a green community. And most recently, he has been involved in their shared solar garden. So he's going to talk a little bit about that and also about, is it true, legislation that's pending that will affect solar in Massachusetts? So without further ado, Eric.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we have 4 projectors here, or 3, and we're lacking the cable. I'm going to try to just speak, but I think it'll be helpful if I refer sometimes to a slide. My talk today, I'm going to make this full screen just because. What's that?
You need an HDMI cable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, if you can wait for me to go home, I can get one in about 15 minutes.
Well, my wife is on her way, and we're from Harvard, so to do that.
Oh, okay.
So hopefully that works. All right. So my talk today is going to be about the Harvard Solar Gardens. What is it? How it works? A little bit of the history. Where we were as a community and what that enabled, how that enabled us to build the Harvard Solar Garden. We had a long road. We started on this in 2011, and the system went live in June. I have the ability to speak to the financial part of it, if people are interested. We can go into that in more depth if people are interested. And also, I wanted to talk about some other examples of community shared solar that are emerging. And then lastly, and we could spend the entire evening on this, I wanted to frame a little bit about what we had and in terms of solar policy in Massachusetts and how that enabled us to get where we are, but how it's changing, and it is changing. So I hope you'll be able to take away, understand what the Harvard Solar Garden is, what policy framework and initiatives were in place to allow it, what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen, but how that could all change with the upcoming legislation. And also, a little, I'm going to make a plug for what you can do if you're interested to keep the state on the leadership of this kind of thing. So what is Harvard Solar Garden? We call it it is the first member-owned, first and only member-owned solar installation in Massachusetts, shared solar. And there are other solar gardens, but they are owned by an investor, and you buy into them either just to get your power, or you get some of the benefits, but you don't get the full benefits of ownership. So that's a distinction that I hope people can understand. So in the same way that you might lease a system from an installer or from a company, and you get the power at a reduced rate, there's a difference, obviously, between that and ownership. And all of our participants are fully owners. It is a ground-mounted installation in Harvard. I keep looking for a Google Maps photo that would have it, but the planes haven't been over in the last few months, I guess. It was designed and built by the premier solar design firm in, we believe, the world. Happens to live in Harvard, Solar Design Associates. Stephen Strong has been in the solar business since the 70s. He's the only one who's ever been cleared technically, and all the other clearances that are needed to put solar in the White House. He does embassies, did the Atlantic Games. We just happened to have him in Harvard, and when we approached him with the idea of doing this, he said, I'd love to. This is important to me. And he actually fought off another company that we were talking with in order to make it happen. In other words, he believes, this is a very difficult project. It was the first of its kind, but he believes in this kind of community effort. It began in 2011 with 38 members at 250 kilowatts. So that's 25 members would be 10 kilowatts each, so it's, you know, between 5 and 7 kilowatts average. It grew to 41. The first, I'm speaking about Harvard Solar Garden 1 now. We divided it up into 2 installations. One, primarily because there was a need in town for 250 kilowatts. And then when we realized that we could do a second one, we had them be separate installations and entities. The second one, Harvard Solar Garden 2, is now fully subscribed and will be completed by the end of the year. Okay, so you get investment protection in terms of it's a fully registered security. It's like selling shares in an investment security. And you get your power generated locally and sustainably, and you get price protection from electricity rates going up, which I don't know how many people have heard about that, but the rates are going up, and I'll talk about that. It happens to be available to anyone in the Western Mass National Grid territory, and there's reasons why that is. If you're generating power, you can sell to anybody in your load zone, and our load zone covers the entire western part of the state, or not the entire, I'm sorry, it covers 100 towns or so. And that is possible because of virtual net metering, which is a part of Massachusetts regulation that electricity does not have to be generated on the same site that it's consumed. It's a very forward-thinking law, and it's enabled this kind of thing to happen. So that is our, I don't know if people can see, but that's just what it looks like if we imagine it and we overlay it onto a property. And I have some photos which you won't really be able to see of the first one. So how does it work? So you purchase and own a percentage of the output of the garden. You don't just own the panels, you essentially own a percentage of the infrastructure as well. The shares are fully eligible for grants from the state, and you are eligible for tax credits, state and federal, because you're the owner, and you're not a nonprofit. If you are a tax-paying entity, then you can get benefits from the tax credits. And it is eligible for SRECs. I don't know how many people know what SRECs are. Okay. I'll go through that a little bit, but it's an incentive that was designed by the state to allow for really to offset the cost of solar, and it's a benefit over time. There's a market for them. SREC stands for Solar Renewable Energy Certificate, and a certificate is created for every megawatt hour that the system produces. And typically 1 kilowatt of solar will generate 1 SREC a year. SRECs were initially priced on the open market at $500 per REC in 2011, which meant, for example, if you had a 5 kilowatt system, you would potentially make $2,500 per year against your initial investment outlay. And those are the terms under which we formed. I mean, that was what the market looked like. And since then, SRECs have gone down in price, but people have hung in there and decided it still makes sense to be a member. Okay. So there is a corporate entity that we formed around this, an LLC. Actually, there are 2. And so we worked with a lawyer to figure that out. And that is necessary for it to receive tax credits and do a lot of the things that it does, and actually have somebody buy into it. So people have looked at it without understanding it and said, well, this is a for-profit corporation. And so as we've gone along, we've received a lot of treatment from local entities and state entities that treat us as a corporation, as a tax, as somebody that's liable for taxes, and that's been, I can talk more about that. So I can answer questions now about what it is and the flavor of it, or as they come up, but I hope everybody kind of understands some of the basics of what it is. Essentially, people couldn't put solar on their houses, but they wanted access to the same benefits that solar provides. And so we had this idea, well, why don't we have this stuff, why don't we have this installation in a location that would virtual net meter to their accounts, and that's the basic idea. And it so happens that that's possible in Massachusetts under the current laws. We got there from our history as a community that went through the process of becoming a green community, which is, I think people in this town are somewhat familiar with that. It's a process that takes some time, but the public gets educated, and you sign up for several initiatives, and you can receive grants to help your town save energy, and that's what we did. This did not happen, our green community status almost happened in spite of the town government. There are other green communities such as Acton, and there are many now, there's in the 40s, maybe more, where the town manager or the mayor or whatever, the town board, the select board is driving the process of becoming a green community because they want to save money on energy, and they want to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and that sort of thing, and those are the fundamental benefits of the program. We did not have that. Everything that we were able to do came from the citizens pushing the board to do. But before we were involved, we really had a community that I think is much like Bolton, where we were doing the low carbon diet, and we were doing 350.org events and whatever. So there was a culture of the town, part of the town anyway, that was looking for these kinds of initiatives and really moving in that direction. And that was really important, because since we didn't have the support of the local politicians, we had to kind of go back to the wellspring of community members to keep driving us towards those goals. Okay, so the Harvard Energy Advisory Committee formed in 2008 as a result of a town meeting where we had some public viewing of our energy costs, and there was an outcry about energy expenditures, and so somebody got up and said, well, we used to have an energy committee, why don't we look at that? And so the committee was formed to help the town save energy. And it just so happened that some people that were eventually on the committee had already started to look to the state for help. There was a state program to allow for audits, free energy audits of town buildings. And we were in the queue for that. And so the Energy Advisory Committee took over that. And those audits produced a series of ECMs, and energy control measures or something like that, which we were able to use as our grant application. So once you become a green community, you jump the hurdles through that are part of the program. You have to pass some bylaws, and you have to develop a 5-year energy plan to reduce your energy by 20%. Then you can apply for grants, and the audits that we had done formed the basis of our grant. So we were really moving along quite nicely. Also, in 2008, 2008 also, as I kind of alluded to, the Green Communities Act was passed, and that's the basis of the Green Communities Program, and the Global Warming Solutions Act, which mandate that the state reduce its carbon footprint over a period of time, and it mandates that the state meet renewable energy targets. And those programs really form the background framework upon which the solar policies evolved. The Renewable Portfolio Standard is a state program that was passed into legislation as part of that 2008 series of laws, that said that the state needed to, the utilities needed to purchase a certain amount of, or supply a certain amount of their power from renewable sources. And that is what forms the market for SRECs, so that the utilities can't necessarily meet those renewable energy targets on their own. They don't have solar themselves, or they don't own wind generating plants. So they end up having to purchase. The details around us becoming a green community with a timeline. Soon after we became a green community, in 2000, we got our certificate in 2011 and 2012. Oh no, that's not right, it was 2010, 2011. Solarized Mass was announced as a benefit. It was initially a pilot program which allowed for green communities to participate in a program that had been envisioned at Mass Clean Energy Center. I don't know how many people have heard of Solarized Mass. Okay.
It was a solarized hybrid as well.
Well, we branded it in our town. And the state was kind of okay with that, but you know, whenever there was official materials that said Solarized Mass, but we talked about it as Solarized Harbor. So we were one of 4 towns around the state that was selected to be a pilot town. They hadn't done this before. They needed to learn. They needed to roll it out in a limited fashion and learn from it. So that's what they did. And I was the Green Community Coordinator, and there was no way I was going to be the Solarized Coordinator. Luckily, somebody else in town had been thinking about this kind of program before, or had been thinking about solar, and by the name of Worth Robbins, who also happens to publish be a publisher of the paper, of the town paper. And Worth, we put together a survey which was available to the townspeople. Are you interested in a program which would give you incentives to purchase solar, you know, and a bunch of questions which measured the public interest. And we submitted that along with our application. It did indicate that a number of people would do it and would move forward if it was a favorable program to them. So we were awarded the Solarized Mass pilot participation, and what essentially the program was, it still is a mechanism to allow some of the marketing to happen neighbor to neighbor. So the idea is the more people that participate, the lower everybody's price gets per watt. Mm-hmm. So if we reached 100 kilowatts of contracts, maybe that's 20 people, 5 kilowatts each, the price suddenly went down for everybody per watt or kilowatt. Same thing. There were 4 tiers. The first, and base price was $5 a watt installed. We were able to get down to $4 a watt, which was, at the time, installed, was the lowest price that anybody had ever heard of. We didn't even think we could get there. But we essentially hit all the incentive targets and got a lot of people signed up. We did enough marketing in town that there were in fact more people that wanted to buy systems but couldn't put them on their houses. The state will not qualify you for a system unless your site, and this is done with measuring instruments and whatnot, unless the panels can receive 80% of the incoming available insolation, they call it, incoming solar radiation. So if you had a large building in front of you, you're not going to you don't have a good site. Or if your roof doesn't face south, whatever. So there were more people that wanted to have these systems that couldn't, and that really was the driving force behind Harvard Solar Garden. Worth, at the point where it became clear, Worth Robbins, that we had more people that wanted to participate than could, he handed the Solarized Coordinator keys to Jim Elkind, a neighbor of mine. The 3 of us had been working together, and he started working on this idea of community shared solar. And he had been thinking about that years before, because the Green Communities Act actually allowed for something called neighborhood net metering, and he couldn't do solar on his property, so he was thinking about how do we do this, and it turns out that the legislation including neighborhood net metering was a little bit flawed. It didn't maximize the benefits to people, so there's never been a neighborhood net metering project. But we realized that there was the opportunity to have this larger installation than neighborhood, and we had to kind of jump through a bunch of hurdles to get that to happen, but that's what we did. So initially we had 35 people that wanted to do this but didn't have the right site. And we started noodling it through. Is this allowed under law? Would we get the state grants for it? What kind of corporate structures do we need? What are the tax implications? Luckily, we had our installer, who is an incredibly accomplished installer. We also had somebody else in town who was a lawyer, an environmental lawyer, who was committed to seeing this through. And so luckily, we were able to get together with her and work through these corporate entity questions and figure it out. I think I see Susie coming in, but maybe not. The other thing that we had was a grant program that the federal government promulgated. And the history of that was that there was and has been a 30% energy investment tax credit that you can get. Essentially, you would take 30% off of the check that you have to write to the government if you've invested in some qualifying renewable energy equipment. And in fact, I think even energy efficiency equipment qualifies. Not enough people were building renewable energy systems using that credit. The government could see that not many people were taking this credit. So they created this grant program, which is essentially, instead of waiting until your tax bill comes and taking 30% off of that, they gave you a check, a grant up front. It's not a credit, it was a cash grant, if you put a renewable energy system in service by a certain time and it met certain qualifications. We met the qualifications for that, and essentially that is a benefit that really we couldn't give up on, we couldn't pass up. So not only did we realize we could qualify for one installation, but we decided that if we could build a second garden, that it would amortize some of the site costs across 2 installations, and it would be better for everybody. It would be a lower cost for everybody if we could sell more. There's economies of scale. Of course, you scale it up to a 6 megawatt facility, and suddenly you're talking about something that no longer feels like a community shared installation. So the idea of community shared solar is that it's not this huge, impediment on the town. It fits into available space. It's member owned. It's not an investor facility, and so we were able to qualify for this federal tax grant, but still be a community shared installation. And if you were to do this today, you would have to figure out how to get that kind of an incentive, and the 1603 grant program sunsetted it, it went away. So we advise people that have asked us about it, what that means and how they might finance a system. The ComSolar grants are available to people if you qualify. If you receive, as I said, the 80% of insulation, then your system can qualify for a grant. And they had a certain amount per watt that you could qualify for, plus a 5 cent watt adder if any of the component of the system was added. We asked Mass Clean Energy Center, would shared solar, would this fall, would you grant people in the system? And they said, well, we don't think so. And it required some, that's a policy change, right? They weren't initially thinking that they would ever have this question. But the more they thought about it, the more they realized, well, we like this. And so after some talking through what the details would be, they added it as a grant category. So if you installer goes, if you have a system and you apply for these grants, it's one of the drop-down menus right now. And that gave us a real boost of encouragement, because we realized that people in the state are behind this idea. Part of the grants allow for, if you qualify for as a moderate income buyer or moderate home value, you get even more incentive, but we could not, they said, we can't do this for you because of the way the specifics of the ownership work. But that's still fine, we still got 45 cents a watt. So the other challenge was SRECs. We weren't sure whether we were gonna qualify, and what the long-term pricing is around these. And so we, initially we thought, well, this is great, we're gonna have a 5-year payback on this stuff. Well, as this went on, the SRECs were allocated under a cap. And when Governor Patrick signed this Green Communities Act, there was something like, there were maybe 3 megawatts of solar in the state installed. And he said, well, I'm gonna set a goal for 250 and then 400. And those caps were installed, and everybody said, there's no way we'll ever reach this. But we did. So by 2012, the cap was, what was it, 2013, the cap was being reached, which meant that we might not qualify for SRECs. And the state was working through how they were gonna formulate a program which continued those benefits. But luckily, we spoke with the Renewable Energy Office, and they said, well, we want community solar to be part of this, and so we're going to guarantee that a community solar project will be allowed in SREC 1. And again, this is incredible, helping hand from the state to make sure that we could get there. They really wanted community solar, and it is a category in SRECs. So, okay. So siting, you asked the question, and I figured I would get to it here. There's a Massachusetts general law saying that no zoning ordinance or bylaw shall prohibit or unreasonably regulate the installation of solar energy systems, except where necessary to protect public health, safety, and welfare. So we thought that we would be able to put this anywhere. And initially, right down the street from us, there was a perfect parcel in residential agricultural zoning. The parcel owner would be an off-taker, and he would lease his land to us, and essentially the lease was that we would give power for free. The building inspector, who happened also to be the most adamant opponent of our green community status, decided he didn't think that we should be allowed to put a commercial entity in a residential parcel. So he denied the building permit, and we went to appeal, and the denial was upheld. So we had to choose a different site. So we said, okay, we're a commercial entity, we're gonna go in the commercial district. We found an owner in the commercial district who was willing to have this on the property. We made sure that it wasn't gonna compromise the value of the commercial land, and we applied for a permit, and the building inspector said, that's not allowed because it's not accessory, the electricity is not accessory to the property, and there's some legalese around that. So because of this general law, we thought that, we really figured that we could take this to the courts, and the Department of Energy Resources wanted us to. We got indications that they would actually like for us to sue because that would establish a precedent in the state. We decided that that was kind of a little bit more confrontational than we wanted to be, and also we wanted to get it done quickly. So we worked with the planning board, got a bylaw crafted which essentially created an exclusion overlay district in the commercial district and allowed for this parcel to be part of that. We had to go to the town meeting and get a vote, and we did. So, as I said before, the townspeople were really behind this, but some people in town government were not. So taxation is also another issue. Luckily for system owners on their homes, there's a law which says that you're exempt for 20 years from taxation if it supplies the energy needs of your property. We figured that, well, this should apply because all we're doing is having the site, it be somewhere else, but it's supplying the energy needs of a property. And Department of Revenue kind of threw up their hands initially and then decided, well, they didn't really think this was a good idea. So we had an amendment to that law filed by Jamie Eldridge. It did not work. It did not move out of committee. The MMA turned out to be against it, the Mass Municipal Association. So we said, well, we're gonna have to figure this out. So we started working with the town on a payment in lieu of taxes, which is a pilot. And the town really kind of wanted us not to be exempt from local tax rates. We even had our assessor who developed a reasonable rate that we thought we could live with, but the town kind of dragged their feet. Finally, we went back again to the town, to a special town meeting, and we passed a resolution to instruct the Board of Selectmen to negotiate a pilot with us. The lawyer for the town said, well, that's non-binding, and they don't have to go by it. So we then were instructed by people in the legislature that one of the best ways to do this was to file what's called a home rule petition with the state legislature, which we had to do, and we did in March, and that added legislation, that added a clause to this paragraph, which added community shared solar as part of one of the kinds of installations that's exempt.
Can you explain what the taxation, the taxes, the shares are taxed?
Well,
or
so it would be treated as a commercial property with, and taxable according to its value. So its value is several $1 million worth of solar panels and whatnot. So if you have a, it's like a property tax, right? And in the same way that if you added an addition onto your house, you're adding to the value of your house, and that becomes the new valuation in your property tax rate.
So if we had one share valued at $1,000, we would pay tax on that $1,000 each year?
Yes,
Okay.
and so essentially the garden would have to pay, which would have raised the price for everybody, right? So it turns out that the state knowingly exempted solar systems on your house because they did not want that kind of tax burden for people having systems. We said this should really be transferable to a community share, and nobody really was going to go with that for us, so we had to kind of once again punch through with our own initiative and make it happen. Permitting was another struggle. We, through Solarize, our town and many other towns in the state developed a flat fee because, again, this is a cost to installing a system. The flat electrical fee is $39 and the building inspection fee is $125 per system. And instead of what happens in a lot of towns is, and in our town, the building inspector says, well, what's the value of this installation? I get, my fees go up, are proportion to the value. And that happened in our town with Carlson's Orchards. I don't know if anybody knows about the system there. Well, there was a huge tax bill associated with that for almost nothing because the building inspector doesn't have to do a lot of work there. I mean, there are posts and whatnot, but it's not a complicated inspection. We were facing a tax burden, a permitting burden of $17,000. So again, we went to the special town meeting and we advised, again, the Board of Selectmen to adopt the flat fees, but we didn't get it. So that ended up being a cost that we could not escape. Another challenge is interconnection. I'm not going to really go into this really too much, but it takes a while. I have all of these blue things are links. It takes a while to go through the process of interconnection with the utility, which makes sense. I mean, they need to know, they need to qualify systems, and the engineering needs to be there. This could have been difficult, but luckily our installer had moved the process well. And the financing of this is also a challenge. So luckily we had the 1603 grant, but the 1603 grant comes when you go live, and we had invoices due before that, so we had to borrow money. There was one bank that gave us financing, but in general, even throughout the time period we were doing this, banks were pretty reluctant to do this. So to speak to the financing, this is actually interesting. So when these lines cross this line, that is your payback period. And these are the assumptions over here for each line. So with a payment, with the pilot, that would be full valuation of the system at a 0% tax inflator and SREX at $200, the system kind of almost doesn't pay itself back. You don't get a payback. The best is no tax and SREC of $250. And that is essentially what we are, what we were able to achieve through the home rule petition. And SRECs have stabilized at about $285. So we're looking at paybacks potentially of, you know, a little more than 10 years.
You know, one of your assumptions there is that the rate inflation is 1%, it just went up 33%.
Right. The payback period
So that
is decreased
really
with
better
every
than
increase
this.
in electricity rates. Correct. Good point. These inflation rates are on the tax, but you're right, this inflation rate on electricity, well, it's hard to tell, and this is going to be interesting over time. Electricity over the last 20 years has gone up an average of 1 to 2% a year, but it's very volatile right now, and we can talk about that.
Eric?
Yes.
How do the rates get set? I'm thinking, you know, National
Electric
Grid's going
rates?
up, and you have all these people you can pick
Okay.
from, and they have different rates.
All right.
So how does the rate get
I
set?
have
from
a
there?
lot of material on that, and I'll talk to that.
Okay.
It's one of the most arcane and complicated processes I've ever seen, and I'm an engineer.
But now, is the rate of the garden something unique and separate from,
No,
say, what National
no, we're a
Grid
National
people
Grid,
do?
we pay the same as a National Grid. So we're in National Grid territory. If you have a municipal power company, such as what Littleton is,
Mhm.
then you work that out with them. But we have a utility. Same with N-Stor, you work it out with them. So we are subject to National Grid rates. We developed these numbers from a calculator that I have, and in fact, Tony, I think I sent it to you. Is that right? I could go through, I got a quote for a system. I could go through and plug numbers into the calculator and show you, but essentially what you end up with is looking at when you pay back, and what we did was we made this available to people and said, we are not tax advisors, we are not investment advisors. You plug in the assumptions that you're comfortable with making, and we'll help you kind of understand what those assumptions mean, but you decide whether this is the right kind of investment for you. And we really had to be very careful, because we're selling something that is of large value, many thousands of dollars, and there are laws against this kind of, you know, and fraud in this field. So we had to say, look, we're not putting, this is opt-in, you know. And I think people respected that. I mean, our assumptions were very conservative about what kind of electricity rate inflation we're likely to get, what kind of SREC prices we're likely to see. We did not go out and sell this aggressively and say, oh, this is going to pay back in X years. We basically tried to say, you know, in fact, what we tried to do was say, this is not an investment vehicle. Sorry. This is, we can't sell this as a win in the same way that somebody would sell you a stock. You really have to think about this as an investment in energy security and kind of a value-based investment. And I think people are respecting that. I wanted to show a couple of other examples. So the state commissioned a report on community shared solar. And this part of the presentation talks about what are some of the other models. And they published a report, which actually they came and interviewed us in Harvard. So if you're trying to do comparisons of other solar gardens, you would read this report, understand what the different components are, and then you might go out looking for who's doing this. The first one in the state that came under the label of community solar was Brewster, and they were operational, I believe, in 2012. They have an investor owner, and they trademarked the phrase community solar garden. And when we didn't know that, we actually reached out to them and said, hey, how are you guys doing this? You know, we'd love to talk with you. And they did not respond, but we finally got a response saying, cease and desist order, do not use the phrase community solar garden. Essentially, you get your power, you have a power purchase agreement with them, and you get some net metering credits. The next model, which you may be familiar with, is being marketed by NextEarth Living. And they are working with the company Clean Energy Collective in Colorado, which was the other installer that initially wanted to do our solar garden, but Stephen Strong convinced us to go with him, luckily. Clean Energy Collective is a great company. They have lots of good things that they offer. They do volume purchasing of systems, they have insurance at low rates, and they will even help you finance. So in the absence of a large community initiative like we had, and 1603 grants, and people that are willing to try to punch through legislation, this is a viable model for community shared solar. It turns out that the person who is driving this at Next Step Living is Patrick Cloney. And I link an article here on their website where he talks about why he thinks this is viable, and why it's really the right thing for people in Massachusetts, because a lot of properties are not able to have solar on them. He was the one who really kind of formulated the Solarize program, and saw while he was doing that not everybody could participate. So this is his, this is his life's work really, and the next step is to make this happen. One of the other more, let's say, less corporate initiatives is from Co-op Power. And I don't know if anybody's heard of Co-op Power, but they are really a grassroots group out in Western Mass that really asks for members to drive initiatives. So if you were going to form a community solar effort through them, then you would become a Co-op Power chapter. They really do have a lot to offer. I went and spoke with them, so I would offer them up as another alternative for people who are looking at community shared solar. Turns out New Hampshire has something where they have a net metering law, so I just put that on there to show people what some of the alternatives are. I will mention this briefly. If people are interested, I can go through it in more detail. There is a way for nonprofits to benefit from community shared solar. In fact, the Harvard Unitarian Church, Harvard Unitarian Universalist Church, has a share in Harvard Solar Garden. And the membership, some people formed a community to fund the system, and that allows for those members to get the SRECs to help offset their donation or their ownership outlay, and they can potentially also reduce their tax burden, tax liability by the amount of electricity they're donating to the church. And there's another article here about another church that did something like this. They had to form an LLC. We didn't have to in our effort because Harvard Solar Garden is already an LLC, so there were some things that were a lot easier for us. Okay, so I'm going to transition to, so this is where I'm going to kind of draw a bow around why all this stuff is available and what's happening now, which could cause a lot of it to go away. So what made this really available to us was the 1603 grant, which is now gone. The 1603 grant was an extension of the 30% investment tax credit, which is going away at the end of 2016 unless it gets extended by Congress. The ComSolar 2 grants, which offset our arrays, our systems by 50 cents a watt, is going away. This is the last block, block 20, and I believe the incentives are down at 25 cents or something like that. The idea behind those grants is that they help offset the cost, and they were sort of scaled to the costs of panels and of installation. So they've been decreasing over time. There's a program that's coming online, which they believe, the state believes, will help sort of offset the loss of that. And then SREC 1, as we talked about, has sunset already, but we were able to continue to qualify. SREC 1 auctions will continue, but no new systems can benefit from SREC 1. There's something in its place. And then net metering caps. We were able to qualify under the net metering cap, and I'll talk a little bit about that. What that is the state has worked out with the utilities that a certain percentage of the power on the grid can be, of peak load, must be allowed to be plugged in from renewable energy, from distributed systems. It's actually a third thing that you have to think about. So the net metering cap was initially 1% and 2% of the load, and now it's at 5% and 6% for private and public entities. So if that cap is hit and it's not raised, then suddenly the utility can turn around to a new customer and say, we don't have to hook you up. And they calculate how much power it is.
So this is now actually coming into play. So in the future, unless Congress acts, there won't be federal incentives. The Mass Solar Loan Program has not been put into place yet, but that is how the department envisions the grants being replaced. So, and what that will allow, it's a low interest loan. There has been a hot water interest, low interest loan or zero interest loan program. So you could get a solar thermal system, which is what you call a hot water system, and get a loan to pay for that at 0% interest. And this is essentially the same kind of program for solar PV. SREC 2 is now in place, and I have it for new systems. Its benefits are a little bit less. You don't get the same SREC amount. You don't get the same value per renewable energy certificate. I can talk more about that. And then the net metering cap is up for grabs. What you will have, once our home rule petition gets written into the law, is you will at least have a property tax exemption, so you won't have to fight that fight in your town. Okay, so SREC 2 is active now. And again, what this is if you buy a system, you will get a certain amount of money depending on how much the auction price is for a megawatt hour of electricity that your system generates. What they did was they decided they wanted to sliding scale the benefit, and so that at you multiply essentially 1.0 by 0.7, they just have a relative value of the certificates by category. And so this is designed to say we want to manage what kinds of systems are incentivized to become online, and we want to encourage canopies, emergency power systems, community shared. And the state has decided that community shared solar is a better kind of system to put in than any other ground-mounted system, or just a large investor-owned PPA. So they've set up a tiered incentive program, and this is sort of an example of the kind of forward-thinking policies that the state has. So this is for your SRECs, which help you offset your investment. They're still in auction, but the minimum price will decline over time. Whereas in SREC 1, the minimum price is not declining. So they've decided that, that solar can sort of keep going a little bit on its own without so much incentive. They want to keep incentivizing it, but they're not going to, give you as much money as you would get before. So that's what's happening with SREC 2. And net metering. So I talked about this, that the net metering law says that the utility has to allow for systems to plug into the grid and get credit for the electricity that they're putting on the grid up to a certain cap. And the cap has been hit and raised twice in the last 5 years. We are about to hit it again, and there was a bill in this summer called, actually 3 bills, but there was a bill to lift this cap and to put in place to essentially remove it, but to do so by and target installed megawatts of 1,600 by 2020. So this was a big deal. The governor was behind it, the DOER was behind it, and it included several components to build it. The SRECs would be simplified. They would reduce the virtual net metering credit so that most systems would have to use their power on site. They remove the cap, but they would also put in what's called a minimum charge. And they said that this is for maintenance of the grid. The idea being that you're using the grid. If you plug a system in, you should pay for it. You should not be allowed to remove all of your bill by net metering. This is an argument that has been gaining credence across the country. In fact, Arizona laws went in place a year ago that basically instituted a minimum bill, and it's happening in Wisconsin. And I have a bullet here. This is being pushed nationally by American Legislative Exchange Council. We don't really know if that is, directly driving the utility. This is a utility sponsored initiative to say, we're not making enough money on these people. And people in the industry say, well, they have a point. If you just take the logical extension of if everybody had a system and fed the grid, and they erased their bill, nobody pays for the grid. So they have a point. What they're not recognizing is that there is a value to them of having distributed generation. And so what happened was, this bill almost passed, but enough people kind of called their legislators in July and August and put it on, and it was halted. And instead what was passed was Senate 2214, which temporarily raised the cap, so it kind of kicked the can down the road on that. And again, the utilities are the ones who are saying, okay, we'll agree to the cap. But when we agree, we want something in return, and the return was this minimum bill.
Eric,
Yes.
I have a question. I don't know if you
Yes.
may not get to this, but as you probably know, there's this proposed gas pipeline through Bolton.
It's
among
very
other
much
things.
related to this.
And, well, I'm sitting here thinking, gee, everyone's saying, oh, we don't have enough solar power, we don't have enough solar power. And what I'm seeing is that there's this stuff out there encouraging people and communities to put solar power online, although it sounds like the utilities.
Utilities don't like it.
No. My mind is blown a little bit here. How, I mean.
Right. So, okay, I said it's very much related. Let me say that it is among the things that are happening now that affect electricity rates and pricing. And what happened last year, and it actually happened in 2010, I believe, was a cold snap. And since Massachusetts and other states have been decommissioning coal, and I don't know how much nuclear going offline is part of that, and then increasing their power generation to natural gas, there has been these supply constrictions. Now, the utilities are an interesting business. They buy from generators. So National Grid is in fact a grid company. They don't own generation. They buy from a company that actually has a turbine that fires gas and whatnot. So and utilities don't have to engage in what's called firm contracts for generation. They purchase generation on a market, on a spot market. And it so happened that they got killed last winter during the cold snap because there was a demand for natural gas for residential and commercial heating, and power generation was competing with that. So essentially what they want to do is to take those losses that they had happened last year by having to buy spot purchasing and transfer them to us now. And say, we need to make money back, essentially. And they're saying that they anticipate this happening into the future, which is why the gas pipeline is kind of an overarching, in the background, argument for it. The gas pipeline, they say, will help relieve these and keep our electricity prices low. Now, I have to say that Conservation Law Foundation has some of the most extensive analysis on this that you could ever want to see, and they believe that this is really a boondoggle, and that the demand on the spot market could be alleviated by several things. It could be the power companies can engage in firm contracts. They can contract through the winter. Yes, they would have a higher price, probably, but it wouldn't be what they paid. So they can essentially rationally go to their customers and say, we need this much more, but because we're buying it into the future. They can also import LNG through several facilities that were available and open, and there was supply that could have come into the ports at that time to alleviate the supply crunch. And then they can also engage in demand reduction programs. They can fix leaks. There's a lot of things that could be done.
There was a story in the Globe a couple of weeks ago about using trucks to transport. the gas rather than the pipeline.
So this is so it's interesting how related these things are, and it's interesting how up in the air all this is right now. And the utilities are at the forefront of saying, well, we want to charge more and we need to make money and we need to build these pipelines. Well, the pipelines, there's two of them. There's the Kinder Morgan, which goes through northern Mass, and then there's the AIM pipeline. Algonquin, right, very good, ex-Spectra AIM.
Yeah.
And that's got to build a new segment across the Hudson River, right? That one will go in, for the most part, through existing lines, they just have to make them bigger. And then the Kinder Morgan is all new. And what both of them do is supply the anticipated market 3 times over. And so if they were just meeting demand, that would be one thing. But they are essentially sizing these things for export. And then people are on top of this.
Do you know, now, as I understand it, and this is so confusing, there are these 3 entities that have their fingers in the whole grid process, but one of them, ISO New England, I think it
Yes.
was, as I understand it, was the one that was responsible for coming up with this forecast that said, oh, you're not gonna have enough
Yes.
capacity. Do they take into account systems like this, and how many people are putting solar on their roofs, and how many?
They have
communities-
to. They have to take into account distributed generation, but it's still a small percentage of it. I mean, by law, we're at maybe 4% private and 5% public generation. So we're not large enough yet. I mean, and then they also have to take into account that what the policies are that allow for the grid to be maintained. And so this is really all on the table. I went and found the current chairman of ISO&E made statements back in 2010 about these cold snaps and about these price hikes. And he said, long term, we can meet these if we reduce our demand and bring on renewable energy. He did. I have 2 quotes of his that he basically saw this problem before he became chairman and said, we just have policy decisions to make essentially. We don't have to meet these by increasing he identified the problem of increasing reliance on natural gas. That is a problem. And it will cause electricity rates to go up, but we don't have to have that problem if we choose not to.
You have quotes or
Yes.
anything there? Could you?
I just read that recently.
Yeah, I went back and searched through his,
Somebody had
Do you
a
have
highlight.
Something that was just
yeah.
shared in the pipeline group, I'm trying to
Oh, in the
remember.
pipeline group?
Yeah, there was something
Oh,
that I
okay.
just read that had, because it had his picture and it had
They
a
are
quote.
trying to,
It made me
talk
CLF
to him.
again,
Yeah,
yeah.
I have 2 quotes by him that essentially speak to this, and he's absolutely right. We have policy choices to make. But essentially, by not being part of the process, we're letting these policy decisions be made by the utilities and the people who make money off of power.
Which is the pipeline that's going through Bolton?
The
The
Kinder Morgan.
Kinder Morgan.
Part of
The
Kinder
same that's
Morgan.
going through Groton.
It's a
Yeah,
branch,
yes.
well, it's a lateral.
Yeah, the Worcester lateral off of that line. is-
Gotcha.
Because
So
we
they're
already have
off
a
that
pipeline
line.
in town, just north of here, and it's going to tee off that and go to Worcester.
Gotcha.
But it's part of that whole bigger project.
So you guys are great. I mean, you're absolutely right. This is all part of the same debate. And what I wanted to sort of bring tonight was a little bit of acknowledgement of how we got here in terms of solar, which was by forward-thinking policy, but now a lot of this stuff is up in the air. So what happened was we put enough pressure on some key legislators to have this bill, this minimum bill, go away. In its place, there was a kind of a kick the can down the road, but form a task force law, which said that there will be a task force to study what net metering should be and how the grid should be paid for. And it was supposed to have been formed the 1st of the month. It has not been formed yet. The governor appoints most of the members, and there's now several articles that have come out which are saying that maybe this is actually going to be delayed. Because for one, the governor's going out of office,
Yeah.
and so are his, appointed officers in these, maybe DPU, in the agencies that are responsible for promulgating and for negotiating with the utilities and whatnot. So it may be delayed for a little while. So we will live with the current law, which is wonderful for now, but we still have this pending, change coming up. So there, a bunch of people across the state have formed an ad hoc group called the Mass Solar Policy Council. And I'm sort of the community solar representative of it, self-appointed. I didn't see anybody else who was familiar with community solar, so I'm sort of, I get the emails and I contribute as I can. There's 3 groups to study the different aspects of, if we break it down, the components of what net metering is about. And this is where I've been reading rate design papers, and it's really, really complicated. So I can share more about this, but essentially what we would like is for the value of solar to be recognized, and for there to be incentives for systems to maintain some incentives, but to still allow for the utilities to recapture what they spend, to not lose money and have the grid be maintained. Really, the solution is to have a smarter grid, to have an enhanced grid, which will allow for the value of solar to even be more utilized so that their costs are lower. But you have to have a lot of grid infrastructure in place to really get there. So I think, I hope what we come up with, or what we come up with, and then what we recommend to the task force is some ways, some ideas that allow for net metering to be retained, but allow for the grid to be maintained. What can you do? Well, there are supposed to be, once the task force is formed, two public comment meetings. You can watch for updates on the task force meetings and the formation from these groups or the Mass Solar Policy Council. Contact your reps and tell them that you want these forward-thinking policies that allow for solar to get where it did. It is, and that you don't want a minimum bill if that's just allowing the utilities to make more money, right? And then for elections, if you are at a candidates forum, ask for the solar. Get this, talk about why this is important. So I thought I would end with this picture of that's Worth, who really, by golly, if he wasn't he took really several years out of his life, and he still is doing it to get this built. That's Senator Eldridge's aide, Kelsey, who's really was incredibly helpful, and then me and Senator Eldridge and I was kind of proud to be able to be in this picture. This was during the ribbon cutting ceremony. And so here, these are the articles that I was mentioning. This is all now, what's net metering, what's happening, where it stands. There's just tons and tons of hubbub about net metering now. That's the law that went into place. Net metering in 2014, where the first battles will be fought. New studies show, this is from Vote Solar. Why is it valuable? What do we need? Volatility in solar policy shakes up. It's really all up in the air. So in order for us to keep this moving forward, we have to tell our representatives we want this. This is good. This is what, not just because of renewable energy, but really because of climate change. And that's ultimately, that is the legal and legislative foundation for a lot of these policies in Massachusetts. It was the Global Warming Solutions Act that said that state needs to supply a certain amount of energy renewably and get away from fossil fuels. Yes.
So throughout this process, you faced enormous barriers
Yes.
from public officials and others. Probably sometimes you said, why the hell am I doing this?
Right.
What kept you moving?
Well, it's just such a compelling idea. And we got enough encouragement from some key people in the state, from the Clean Energy Center. They said, yep, we think this works. The head of Green Communities Division was behind us. I have to say that, well, we also knew that it was possible given certain things happening, right? There were really cost barriers. The siting barrier was a big one, but we knew we had a law behind us. We decided not to sue, but we figured that the townspeople would be at our back. So we figured that eventually we could prevail. But that doesn't mean that there's somebody who's gonna keep getting up every day and doing it, and that really was worth Robbins.
And your mantra when you'd be going out for the third or fourth night in a row was, I believe in solar energy.
I would go to the next meeting saying, I'm doing this because I believe in community shared solar. And so did Stephen Strong. You know, we wouldn't have been able to do it without him from Solar Design. And Ruth Stillman, who's our lawyer. So we had, you know, some people who really were strong leaders behind us. I hope that answered the question. It was personal motivation, the community, and key state backing.
So were the utilities trying to work against this in the state?
Well, they didn't have a lot to say because the laws at the time, they could have held up our interconnection, for example, but they would have been hung out to dry. So they were essentially mandated to allow this. When they get a chance, which is now, to have a say is when the net metering cap gets bumped up against, or when they file a rate case, which is what they're doing now. They filed a rate redesign. So they essentially negotiate with the Department of Public Utilities every so few years and say, well, we're not going to do this anymore, or whatever. And that bill that was at issue this summer was the result of negotiations between the utilities and some industry players.
Mm-hmm.
So for the time period that we were doing it, they couldn't block it, essentially. But now they can, as I'll go back, this slide, yeah. The bill included a reduced virtual net metering credit. And in fact, I have not seen the number that would have been, but essentially what that would mean if this went through is that even Harvard Solar Garden customers would not be able to get full credit for the electricity that they were generating, and which would mean they would have a charge on their bill, and which would mean the payback period would go longer. And if that was in place when we were selling it, people would have looked at the payback period and said, we're not going to do this, you know. So this legislation will hurt if it goes through. It will hurt current. They're not grandfathering it. It's the new electricity rates which this would apply to. So we have to keep fighting.
So I guess my ultimate question is, where does Massachusetts stay relative to the nation? And what struck me was there was a program on, a very short program, down in Bedford Harbor's very serious contamination, and there was a Superfund site called Sullivan's Ledge. And that is going to be used as a solar farm. And during this discussion, they said, of the cities in the United States of America, how much of the city power is generated by solar? New Bedford was said number 2 in the United States for generation.
Yeah, I actually saw that.
So it just seems to be astounding that Massachusetts, climate, solar's no good in the Northeast, that Massachusetts seems to be pretty much
our laws are second really only to California's in terms of favorability. That's why Clean Energy Collective is here. They're a Colorado company. They're here because they saw that Massachusetts has favor up until now.
Mm-hmm.
It's really up in the air. We have to fight for this.
Well, I think it's a wonderful idea because so many of us have trees and I don't want to cut them down. We've already cut enough.
That's right, and actually, I'm sorry, that brings up an important benefit of community shared solar is that If you distributed those panels back out onto people's houses, let's say they could, but they were not optimal, you, some of the systems would have some shade during the day, the roof wouldn't be at the right angle. When you put them in one site and you clear a little, we didn't have to clear that much, suddenly the premium of community shared solar becomes real. You generate more power per panel than you would if you distributed those systems at random locations around the town. That's incredible. I mean, there's some real value to doing this. Now, what we, you scale it up and it becomes this big burden. Where are we going to put it? The idea is to have it be part of the community, in a place where everybody agrees, that it can go here without compromising the value of the town. And so 500 kilowatts or whatever, the idea really, and in fact, most of these large sites have been sort of plotted out and identified by the large investor-driven utilities, or, companies. So community shared solar still has room to grow because it really should fit into a neighborhood or a smaller parcel. So it's the one area which Massachusetts really can continue to grow in, and we just, we have to keep fighting for it to stay part of the options.
Would the solar, hot water, heating come under that?
No, because that really has to be used on site almost, and it's not, it doesn't require net metering, it's not part of it doesn't affect the grid. I mean, there are concentrated solar power plants in California, but I don't think people would do that here, so it's a different animal altogether.
How much acreage does the 500 kilowatt system take?
We cleared
cover?
about 4 acres, but it doesn't have to take that much. I mean, in fact, you could probably get it on an acre and a half or something like that.
And we're always saying, whenever we go to the dump, that there should be solar panels on this, like Acton has just done.
Yeah.
I think Concord maybe has done.
Yeah,
They've,
yeah,
cover the old landfill.
that's right.
It's land, although I noticed that on your chart, landfills and brownfield sites is third in the category.
Yeah, well,
of
they're
getting-
still above the
Yes, right.
large, just investor-owned thing, yeah. I'm not
So
sure
an
why.
example of the investor-owned would be the one here behind Bolton Orchards.
I think so,
Yeah.
I think that's it, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's been a huge rush to build those because they can make money. And our whole reason for being is that we don't want money to be taken out, it should just go through to the homeowners as much as possible.
Well, presumably you could put a community system on top of a public land, like the dump,
Yes.
and you would score on two things.
That's what we tried to do.
On the roofs of all the schools,
Yeah.
yeah, big flat roofs on all the
So,
schools.
bring it to the town, say, we want to do this.
How much is on the roof at Bromfield, Harvard?
The minimum system, it's actually on Hildreth Elementary, we
it's on the
had to put it on the elementary school, and we're still talking about putting a system on. We've been approached by a company that wants to do that.
But that wouldn't be part of the community
It would,
garden.
unless, I mean, there are private companies that want to do that, so, we would have to accept that. But we could do another one, we could absolutely do another community solar garden in Harvard if there was enough demand and there was enough citizen initiative to make it happen.
Is there a limit on the size of the community garden idea that works? I mean, given the current laws?
Class of facility.
Number of
I'm-
shares or.
Class facility, that's a good question. I believe there is. That's a good question. There is. It can't, it's a certain class of facility which has its upper limit. And I want to say a megawatt, but I don't know, so I don't know the answer to that.
Could Bolton citizens get onto your garden, or would that
Yes.
be good?
We actually tried to,
I think there
We
were
actually
emails
did-
around about
yeah.
that.
yes, we were making ourselves available through our friends in Bolton to talk about it, and you can still get on the waiting list. One of the things that's interesting about this kind of idea is that if the current owner decides they're moving and they can't transfer, if they move within the load zone,
Yeah.
they just have it switched to their new account. But if they move and they move out of the load zone, then the share becomes available. Now we have a waiting list, so, of people in and out of town that would like to buy in because they want to protect themselves from electricity price hikes. And there is a waiting list.
That's what I don't understand. How are you protecting yourself from price hikes? Because didn't you say that you're subject to whatever rates National
Well,
Grid has?
So your electricity is really free, whatever you offset, if the net metering law holds.
Right.
So,
Okay.
if everybody else is paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour, but you're generating all your electricity, then you're not paying that, right? That's how you're protected.
Yeah.
But if the net metering law doesn't hold, then we are not as protected from rate increases.
Right.
And we did not think that the net metering, I mean, nobody thought that this thing could get blown up, but.
Who knows?
And there will be some kind of net metering, but it just won't be as advantageous unless we do the work to, you know?
The solar on Oak Hill, is that part of your thing? or
Yeah,
is
you saw that,
separate?
I was gonna bring
I
up,
drove by it and I wondered,
oh, you're near Oak Hill Road?
well, no, but I've gone
Drive
through that
through.
way.
Oh,
Yeah.
the Carlsons?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, they,
Not Carlson's, but, where the center of Harvard is, you go up the hill.
yeah, that is there's Carlson's has an orchard up there.
Oh,
That's- yep.
that's theirs?
Yeah, that's a
Okay.
220 kilowatt array, and it's
Yeah.
owned by them.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's for them,
That's right. They use it all on site for refrigeration and water.
yeah.
Do some of the shares belong to the town to offset their energy
We gave
costs,
them
or is
an
it
option
all,
to buy in.
or it's all individual homeowners who?
It's all
belong to
individuals
it?
and some businesses.
It's a business,
Yeah. We gave them an option to buy in. We wanted, in fact, that was what we wanted to do for the pilot, for the payment in lieu of taxes. We had early discussions with them. Would you like to, we'll contribute to the town's energy use through this and, as our tax bill.
Right, 'cause
But
it seemed to be, there was a committee formed to help reduce the town's energy use.
Yes.
So you thought that this would tie together. but I
That
guess
should,
it didn't.
that should, well, no, I know.
That's-
it's-
That's not always works
it's-
that way.
It's
It's
got
wonderful how
difficult.
long-sighted they all are, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hmm.